Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves transported to a muddy, chaotic medieval battlefield. Imagine the roar of the crowd, the metallic clang of steel on steel, the panicked whinnying of horses. You're standing shoulder to shoulder with your fellow soldiers, the air thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and something vaguely unpleasant. You grip your spear a little tighter, the weight grounding you as the enemy line surges forward. Of course, you probably won't survive this, not really, but let's pretend, shall we? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments below. I'm always curious to see where in the world you guys are listening. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge forward, spurred by the sheer terror of what's about to happen. Forget everything you've seen in Hollywood movies, the perfectly choreographed sword fights, the gleaming armor, the heroic speeches that rally the troops. This is anything but. This is messy, brutal, and terrifyingly real. That armor, for instance. It's not all shining plate. Most soldiers on a medieval battlefield wouldn't have been rocking a full suit of armor unless they were wealthy nobles or knights. Instead, think more along the lines of padded gambesons, chainmail, and maybe a helmet if you were lucky. And that chainmail? Heavy. Like, seriously heavy. You're already sweating, and the battle hasn't even truly begun. Historians still argue about the actual weight of medieval armor, but let's just say you wouldn't want to run a marathon in it. Imagine trying to maneuver in it while someone is trying to bash your skull in with a mace. Fun times. Now, that mace, let's talk about weapons. You see all those swords in films. Swords were important, sure, but they weren't the be-all and end-all of medieval weaponry. Polearms, like your spear, were far more common. Cheaper to produce and easier to train soldiers to use effectively, they were the workhorses of medieval armies. And then there were the axes, the maces, the flails, and a whole host of other implements designed to bludgeon, pierce, and generally ruin someone's day. Oh, and don't forget the archers. They're not just peppering the enemy with arrows from afar. They're unleashing volleys that blot out the sun, creating a terrifying rain of death. In fact, one quirky fact, during some battles, archers would aim their arrows high into the air, not just at the enemy line, but hoping to have arrows fall behind enemy lines, causing panic and disruption. It was basically medieval psychological warfare. The battle commences with a deafening crash. The lines collide, and suddenly you're in a swirling mass of bodies, steel, and adrenaline. The smell of blood is overwhelming, and the sounds are even worse, the screams of the wounded, the grunts of exertion, the sickening thud of metal on bone. You thrust your spear forward, aiming for any vulnerable spot you can find. It's not elegant, it's not heroic, it's just survival. And speaking of survival, you notice that guy over there, the one with the gleaming breastplate and fancy helmet? He's probably got better odds than you. Class played a huge role in medieval warfare. The nobles and knights, with their superior equipment and training, often formed the elite fighting force. You, on the other hand, are likely a peasant levy, armed with whatever you could scrape together. But don't think that nobles were invincible. Many famous knights met their end on the battlefield. And sometimes, social class would determine how you fought even within the ranks. For instance, common soldiers may have been expected to loot the bodies of the fallen after a battle, while knights were held to a code of honor that prohibited such behavior. Historians still debate how strictly these codes were followed, of course. You parry a blow with your shield, a lucky deflection. Your arm aches, but you press on. You remember the brief training you received, hold the line, trust your comrades, and above all, don't run. Easier said than done when a hulking warrior with a battle axe is charging towards you. Did you know that battle axe is a family name? It comes from the Old Norman buttely axe, or someone skilled with an axe in battle. Modern portrayals often depict medieval combat as this glorious, individualistic affair. But the reality was far more about unit cohesion and discipline. Soldiers were trained to fight in formations, to support each other, and to follow orders. A well-disciplined unit could withstand even the most ferocious attacks. And sometimes those units would have distinct banners or war cries that were particular to that group of people. In that chaotic mess, some visual or auditory cue to rally and coordinate could be the difference between winning and losing. You manage to duck under the axe swing, the wind of it whistling past your ear. Time seems to slow down. Your breath hitches. Just then, a fellow soldier slams into the axe-wielding maniac, knocking him off balance. You use the opportunity to thrust your spear again. This time, it finds its mark. The fighting continues, a brutal dance of death. But then, a horn sounds in the distance. The enemy line begins to waver. Your side roars with renewed vigor. The tide is turning. You push forward, fueled by adrenaline and a desperate hope for survival. And suddenly, it's over. The enemy breaks and flees. The battlefield falls silent, save for the moans of the wounded and the cries of the dying. You stand there, panting, covered in blood and grime, barely believing you're still alive. You probably have some cuts and bruises, maybe even a broken bone or two. The victory is bittersweet. All around you are the bodies of your comrades, their lives cut short in this brutal clash. War is never glorious. And that's something Hollywood often gets wrong. It's not about heroism or honor. It's about survival. You stumble away from the carnage, already thinking about the next battle, the next threat. Because in the medieval world, peace was a rare and precious commodity. One quirky story to lighten the mood: some medieval armies employed musicians on the battlefield. Not for morale alone, but also to use the sound of their instruments to communicate orders across long distances. Imagine getting strategic advice from a trombone player. And while we're on that topic, medieval warfare wasn't just about battles. Sieges were a huge part of medieval conflicts. Think long, drawn-out affairs, where armies would lay siege to castles and cities, trying to starve out the defenders. They used all sorts of siege engines, catapults, trebuchets, battering rams, to try and breach the walls. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of different siege tactics, but one thing is for sure: siege warfare was a grueling and often deadly business. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that the medieval battlefield was a far cry from the romanticized versions you see on screen. It was a messy, brutal, and often terrifying place. But it was also a place where courage, resilience, and camaraderie could mean the difference between life and death. Right, settle in, settle in. Let's talk medieval battles. You probably picture a swirling, chaotic mess, right? Like a human mosh pit in full plate armor. Well, you're not entirely wrong, of course. But there's actually a surprising amount of order lurking beneath all that steel and yelling. Think of it less as a free-for-all and more like, well, a highly structured free-for-all. Yeah, that makes sense. Imagine yourself there. You trudge onto the field, the weight of your gambeson, hauberk, and helmet already pressing down. The sun, if it's cooperating, glints off the assembled ranks, a shimmering ocean of metal. You can already feel the nervous energy humming through the ground, a tangible vibration like standing too close to a subwoofer. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, horse, and, well, whatever passed for deodorant in the 14th century. Spoiler alert, it wasn't great. Probably just some herbs shoved up their sleeves. Hope they remembered to shower that morning, eh? Actually, scratch that. Showers were probably a very low priority for the medieval soldier. And you wait. The agonizing wait before the battle begins. The silence, broken only by the shuffling of feet and the occasional nervous cough, is almost unbearable. That's when the commanders start doing their thing. You may not realize it amidst the, excitement, but medieval battles were often carefully planned and orchestrated. Far from just charging in, commanders deployed troops in specific formations, designed to maximize their strengths and exploit the enemy's weaknesses. We're talking about formations like the shield wall, a dense line of men with overlapping shields, or the schiltron, a defensive circle of spearmen that proved particularly effective against cavalry. It's actually quite genius, if you think about it. One of the most well-known facts of the medieval era, of course, is the knight. They formed a heavily armored cavalry, which was a dominant force on many battlefields, and their charge was often decisive. But contrary to popular belief, knights weren't just randomly galloping around like crazed bumblebees. They were often used strategically, targeting weak points in the enemy lines or flanking maneuvers. Also, all that armor, imagine the tan lines. You'd have to be extremely dedicated to your sunless tanning routine to make it work. Of course, things rarely go exactly according to plan. Battles, by their very nature, are unpredictable. The terrain, the weather, the morale of the troops, all these factors can drastically alter the course of events. But the underlying structure, the carefully laid plans, were always there, providing a framework for the chaos. You hear the trumpets blare. A wave of goosebumps erupts on your arms. Here we go. Your heart pounds in your chest, a frantic drumbeat against your ribs. You grip your weapon tighter. This is it. This is really it. The enemy lines begin to move. A roar, a primal scream of defiance and fear, erupts from both sides. And then, the clash. The shield wall slams into the enemy line. The impact is deafening, a cacophony of steel against steel, shouts and groans. You shove your shield forward, pressing against the man beside you. Every muscle in your body strains with the effort. You feel the enemy's weight against your shield, a constant, relentless pressure. It's like trying to hold back a tidal wave. Fun times. The fighting is brutal, close quarters, and utterly exhausting. You thrust with your sword, aiming for any opening in the enemy's armor. You parry blows, deflect attacks, and try to maintain your footing in the ever-shifting mass of bodies. It's a swirling vortex of violence, a desperate struggle for survival. And amidst all this, surprisingly, discipline sometimes held. Commanders would use trumpets, banners, or even shouted commands to direct their troops, attempting to maintain some semblance of order on the battlefield. Historians still argue whether these commands were actually effective in the heat of battle. Were soldiers able to hear and understand them amidst the noise and confusion? Or were they largely ignored, reduced to mere background noise? Some historians claim that the banners and trumpets were as much about morale as they were about actual command and control. A visual and oral reassurance that someone was in charge, even if that someone was hopelessly out of touch with the reality of the situation. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Did you know that some medieval armies employed war dogs? Yep, trained canines, often mastiffs or Great Danes, unleashed on the enemy ranks. Imagine facing a snarling, armored dog in the middle of a battle. Talk about adding insult to injury. Or, more accurately, bite to injury. I bet those were very good boys, and girls. Just hope they were trained properly. Otherwise, you'd end up with a furry little friend nipping at your heels instead. The battle continues. Hours pass in a blur of violence and exhaustion. The ground is slick with blood and mud. The air is thick with the stench of death. Men fall all around you, some screaming, some silent, some, well, let's just say you don't want to look too closely. The mental image will haunt you for days. Weeks, even. Actually, maybe forever. The tide of battle ebbs and flows. Sometimes your side gains ground, pushing the enemy back. Sometimes, the enemy surges forward, threatening to break your line. You just keep fighting. You keep pushing. You keep surviving. Eventually, one side begins to break. The enemy lines falter. Men turn and run. A collective sigh of relief sweeps through your ranks. You have won. Or, at least, you've survived. Victory, however hollow it may seem amidst the carnage, is yours. You survey the battlefield. The scene is a grim tableau of death and destruction. Bodies litter the ground. Wounded men moan in agony. The air is heavy with the smell of blood and despair. You are alive. But at what cost? The Middle Ages have many more surprising facts, such as the fact that most people were not, in fact, serfs. There was a burgeoning and wealthy merchant class that was in direct conflict with the social norms of the day. It was often difficult for people in those roles to marry into noble families, though not unheard of, creating an interesting social dynamic. You trudge off the field, the weight of your armor feeling even heavier now. You are exhausted, both physically and emotionally. You are changed. You have seen things that no one should ever see. You have done things that you will never forget. And as you walk away, you realize that the battle was not just a chaotic mess. It was a carefully orchestrated dance of death, a brutal and terrifying display of human ingenuity and savagery. And it was, in its own twisted way, a masterpiece of organization. Or, maybe I'm just trying to find some meaning in all the madness. It was a really bad day, right? So, let's all have a nice warm mug of something comforting and try to forget all about the unpleasantness. Yeah. That's probably the best course of action. And let's not forget that they weren't always grimdark, there were certainly some medieval party animals who enjoyed their lives to the fullest. Although, historians still debate the extent of peasant rebellions and their impact on medieval society. Some argue that these uprisings were widespread and significantly challenged the existing power structures. Others believe that they were relatively isolated events, with limited long-term consequences. But that is a topic for another time. Sleep well, everyone, and may your dreams be free of shield walls and angry war dogs. Unless, of course, you like shield walls and angry war dogs. In which case, dream away. I'm not here to judge. Just trying to give you a few facts and a gentle nudge towards a restful night's sleep. Good night. Alright, settle in, settle in. Pull up a cushion, maybe grab a blankie. We're diving deeper into the fascinating, and often surprisingly practical, world of historical weaponry. Swords, yeah, they're cool. Shiny, iconic, but let's be honest, sometimes they get all the glory while the unsung heroes of the battlefield are left gathering dust in the armory. Like that one band member who's really good but always stands in the shadow of the lead guitarist. We're here to shine a spotlight on the rest of the team. So, you're probably picturing knights in shining armor, hacking and slashing with gleaming longswords. And hey, that happened. We've all seen the movies. The medieval era was definitely prime time for sword-based shenanigans. But even then, the sword wasn't always king. Swords were expensive, Imagine dropping a few $1,000s, or the medieval equivalent in cows and land deeds, on a weapon that could easily get nicked, broken, or worse, captured by the enemy. Think about that next time you impulse buy that fancy gadget online. Was it really worth it? Because of that cost, most common soldiers would probably rely on something a little less extravagant. Something like a spear. Simple, effective, and cheap to produce. Historians still argue whether the spear's prevalence was due to its affordability or battlefield effectiveness. Probably a bit of both, if we're being honest. You trudge onto the battlefield, spear in hand, forming a bristling wall of pointy death. Not as glamorous as swinging a broadsword, sure, but definitely more likely to keep you alive. A spear could keep an enemy at bay, disrupt cavalry charges, and, poke holes in people. It's surprisingly versatile, kind of like duct tape for medieval warfare. And speaking of keeping enemies at bay, let's not forget the humble poleaxe. Now, this isn't your lumberjack's axe, mind you. This is a purpose-built weapon designed to ruin someone's day. Imagine a hammer, an axe blade, a spike, all crammed onto the end of a long pole. It was a versatile tool for dismounting knights and cracking helmets. You heft the poleaxe, feeling its weight in your hands. The polished wood is cool beneath your fingers, the metal head gleaming dully. You can feel the potential energy humming within it. It's the medieval equivalent of a Swiss Army knife, if the Swiss Army knife was designed to dismantle armored opponents. It's effective, sure, but swinging that thing all day must have been a serious workout. I'm getting tired just thinking about it. Now, you might be thinking, okay, spears and poleaxes, got it. But what about ranged weapons? Didn't they use bows and arrows? Absolutely. And they were far more important than Hollywood often portrays. The English longbow, for example, played a pivotal role in several key battles during the 100 Years' War. Those archers weren't just firing willy-nilly. They were trained professionals, capable of unleashing a hail of arrows with incredible accuracy and force. Imagine standing on the receiving end of that. You stand in the field, and you hear it first, a low hum growing to a deafening roar. Then, the sky darkens as hundreds, maybe thousands of arrows arc towards you, each one tipped with a nasty arrowhead designed to pierce armor. Suddenly, that shiny suit of plate mail doesn't seem so protective anymore. It's less knight in shining armor, and more porcupine in shining armor. But it wasn't all longbows and bodkin points. There were crossbows, too. They were slower to reload than longbows, but they required less strength to operate and could deliver a devastatingly powerful shot. You crank the winch, drawing back the string with a satisfying click. The tension builds, and you sight down the weapon, lining up the target. You squeeze the trigger and, thwack, the bolt flies true, punching through armor like a hot knife through butter. And, on the more fringe side of things, some historians claim that even sophisticated repeating crossbows were developed in ancient China, capable of firing multiple bolts in quick succession. Historians still argue whether these repeating crossbows were truly effective on the battlefield, or if they were more of a novelty item. Either way, I bet the guys on the receiving end weren't laughing. Of course, you can't talk about ranged weapons without mentioning siege weaponry. Catapults, trebuchets, ballistae, these were the heavy hitters, the artillery of the ancient and medieval world. Imagine the sheer terror of being inside a castle as massive stones are hurled at your walls, slowly but surely reducing your defenses to rubble. You huddle in the shadows, the ground trembling beneath your feet with each impact. Dust and debris rain down from the ceiling as another section of the wall crumbles. The air is filled with the screams of the injured and the roar of the siege engines. Not exactly a relaxing spa day. And, let's be real, sometimes the best weapon isn't a weapon at all. It's a good, old-fashioned tool repurposed for a fight. A farmer's scythe, a blacksmith's hammer, a carpenter's adze, these everyday implements could be surprisingly effective in the hands of a determined peasant. You grab the scythe, its blade sharpened to a razor edge. It's not elegant, it's not refined, but it's deadly. You swing it in a wide arc, clearing a path through the enemy ranks. The blade sings through the air, leaving a trail of chaos and destruction in its wake. It's resourcefulness at its finest. And it highlights a crucial point: war is about more than just fancy weapons. It's about ingenuity, adaptability, and the will to survive. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about some of the less conventional weapons out there. I'm talking about things that are just plain weird. Like the chakram, a steel throwing ring used in India. Imagine trying to wield that thing effectively. You spin the chakram on your finger, feeling its weight and balance. Then, with a flick of the wrist, you launch it through the air, hoping it finds its target. More likely, it comes whirling back at you like a boomerang of doom. Or, how about the kusarigama, a Japanese weapon consisting of a sickle attached to a chain with a weight on the end? That sounds like a recipe for accidentally hitting yourself in the face. You practice with the kusarigama, swinging the chain and sickle in intricate patterns. You try to ensnare your opponent's weapon or limbs, but mostly you just end up tangling yourself in the chain. It's like trying to fight with a cat attached to a rope. And speaking of Japan, let's not forget the ninja. While Hollywood often portrays them as superhuman assassins with magical powers, the reality was probably a bit more grounded. They were skilled spies and saboteurs, relying on stealth, deception, and a variety of unusual weapons to get the job done. Smoke bombs, caltrops, shuriken, throwing stars, these were the tools of their trade. You move through the shadows, silent and unseen. You plant a caltrop in the enemy's path, set a smoke bomb to cover your escape, and then vanish into the night like a whisper in the wind. I imagine their dry cleaning bills were astronomical though. All that black clothing must have faded fast. Fun fact, ninjas were known to use disguises to blend in with the local population. Historians still argue whether some ninja clans possessed advanced knowledge of poisons and medicines, or if these claims are simply exaggerations. Either way, you wouldn't want to mess with them. So, there you have it. A glimpse into the wider world of historical weaponry, beyond the gleaming allure of swords. From spears and poleaxes to longbows and trebuchets, from scythes and sickles to chakrams and kusarigama, there's a whole arsenal of fascinating implements out there. And each one tells a story about the ingenuity, the resourcefulness, and the sheer determination of the people who wielded them. It really drives home the point that war is messy, complicated, and rarely as glamorous as it's portrayed on the big screen. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to go lie down. All this talk of weaponry has made me sleepy. I'm gonna dream of chakrams. I think. Okay, settle in, grab your chamomile tea, and let's get cozy. We're diving into the surprisingly practical world of armor. Not just the shiny, romanticized version you see in movies, but the real deal. The stuff that actually kept people alive, or, at least, tried to. So, you trudge onto the battlefield. It's muddy, probably smells vaguely of manure and fear, and the air is thick with anticipation, and possibly arrows. You're not exactly thrilled to be here, but hey, duty calls. And thankfully, you're wearing something more substantial than just your grandma's knitted sweater. That something, of course, is armor. Think of armor as your personal, slightly cumbersome, metal cocoon. Its basic purpose is simple, to stop pointy things from turning you into a human pin cushion. But it's evolved drastically over the centuries. We're not talking about just plate armor, though we'll definitely get to that glorious, gleaming metal. We're talking about everything from boiled leather to chainmail, gambesons, and even, briefly, coconut armor. Yes, you heard right. Coconut armor. For realsies. Though, let's be honest, I doubt it stopped much more than a particularly aggressive fruit fly. The earliest forms of armor were pretty basic. Imagine a thick, quilted jacket made of layers of linen or hemp. This is essentially a gambeson, and it's way more important than you might think. It's your base layer, providing crucial padding under heavier armor. It acts like a medieval shock absorber, spreading the impact of a blow and preventing your bones from turning to dust. Plus, it's surprisingly warm. Perfect for those chilly mornings spent waiting for the enemy to show up. Now, you may be picturing some peasant hastily sewing together rags. And while that might be partially true, gambesons could be surprisingly sophisticated. Some were even reinforced with bits of bone or horn sewn into the layers. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of body armor. Historians still argue whether the quality of gambesons had a measurable impact on battlefield survival rates, but logically, more padding is definitely better than less, right? I mean, it's like arguing if marshmallows are good for you. More marshmallows are always better. Case closed. Next up, leather. Now, leather armor often gets a bad rap in historical accuracy circles, but it was actually pretty common. Especially for those who couldn't afford metal. Boiled leather, or cuir bouilli, was hardened by soaking it in water or wax, then shaping it while it was still pliable. This made it surprisingly tough. Not quite as strong as steel, mind you, but much lighter and more affordable. Plus, you could make it look pretty fancy with some tooling. Imagine a leather breastplate, embossed with dragons or lions. You'd look intimidating, and at least somewhat protected. You know, as long as you weren't facing a knight in full plate. Which, let's be honest, was probably the case. Then we come to the granddaddy of early armor, chainmail. Or chain mail, if you want to be all fancy about it. Each ring is interlinked with 4 others, creating a flexible, surprisingly strong mesh. Making chainmail was an incredibly time-consuming process. Each ring had to be individually forged, punched, and linked together. A single hauberk, a chainmail shirt, could take months to produce. It was a serious investment, and a sign of status. Now, you might think chainmail is impenetrable, but it wasn't foolproof. Arrows could still get through, especially at close range. And blunt force trauma was still a major threat. Imagine getting hit by a mace while wearing chainmail. The mail might prevent the mace from actually piercing your skin, but the force of the blow could still break your ribs and leave you gasping for air. Fun times, right? So, remember that gambeson we talked about earlier? Yeah, that was even more important now. Here's a quirky fact: the Bayeux Tapestry, depicting the Norman conquest of England in 1066, famously shows Norman soldiers wearing chainmail. What's less well known is that some of those soldiers are also depicted wearing pants. Yes, pants. Apparently, even medieval warriors appreciated a bit of leg comfort. Who knew? Speaking of the Normans, William the Conqueror is said to have worn a particularly fine suit of chainmail at the Battle of Hastings. Legend has it that he even raised his helmet to show his face to his troops after a rumor spread that he had been killed. Talk about a mic drop moment. Or, more accurately, a helmet drop moment. Okay, now let's move on to the big leagues, plate armor. Ah, plate armor. The epitome of medieval cool. Gleaming, polished steel, sculpted to fit your body like a second skin, a very heavy, metal second skin. It's the kind of armor you see in museums and fantasize about wearing while storming your local supermarket. But here's the thing, plate armor wasn't just about looking good. It was also incredibly effective. A well-made suit of plate armor could deflect arrows, absorb blows from swords and axes, and even protect you from glancing blows from lances. And contrary to popular belief, it wasn't as restrictive as you might think. A properly fitted suit of plate armor allowed for a surprising range of motion. You could run, jump, and even somersault, though maybe not after a large meal. The evolution of plate armor was a gradual process. Early plate armor consisted of individual pieces of steel attached to a chainmail base. Over time, these pieces became larger and more complex, eventually culminating in the full suits of plate armor that we associate with the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. The development of plate armor was directly tied to the advancements in metallurgy and craftsmanship. It required skilled blacksmiths and armorers who knew how to work with steel and shape it to fit the human body. I would hazard a guess that blacksmiths and armorers were the rock stars of their day. One of the key components of plate armor was the helmet. Helmets came in a variety of shapes and sizes, each designed to offer different levels of protection. Some helmets, like the Great Helm, offered maximum protection but severely restricted vision. Others, like the Sowlet, offered better visibility but less protection. Choosing the right helmet was a matter of balancing protection and practicality. It's kind of like deciding what to binge watch. Do you go for the critically acclaimed drama that requires you to pay constant attention, or the fluffy rom-com that lets you switch your brain off for a couple of hours? The choice is yours. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, the cost of armor. Plate armor was expensive. Like, ridiculously expensive. A full suit of plate armor could cost more than a house. It was a symbol of wealth and status, reserved for the elite knights and nobles of the era. The cost of armor explains why it was often passed down from one generation to the next. It was an investment that could last for centuries. So, if armor was so effective, why did it eventually fall out of favor? The answer is simple: gunpowder. The development of firearms rendered armor increasingly obsolete. A well-aimed bullet could easily penetrate even the thickest plate armor. Armorers tried to adapt by making armor thicker and stronger, but this only made it heavier and more cumbersome. Eventually, armor became more of a ceremonial object than a practical piece of equipment. Armor did have a brief resurgence during World War I. Soldiers wore steel helmets and breastplates in the trenches to protect themselves from shrapnel and bullets. But these were far from the elaborate suits of plate armor of the Middle Ages. They were simply a practical way to increase survivability in a brutal and unforgiving environment. Historians still argue about the exact impact of armor on medieval warfare. Did it give knights an overwhelming advantage on the battlefield? Or was it simply a costly and ineffective way to protect themselves from harm? The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Armor certainly offered a degree of protection, but it wasn't invincible. And it came at a significant cost. So, there you have it, a whirlwind tour of the history of armor. From humble gambesons to gleaming plate, armor has played a crucial role in human history. It's a testament to human ingenuity and our relentless desire to protect ourselves from harm. And while we may not wear armor on a daily basis anymore, unless you work in law enforcement, of course, its legacy lives on in our fascination with knights, battles, and the endless quest for self-preservation. Time to get some rest. Good night. Sleep tight. Don't let the bed bugs bite. Unless they're wearing tiny suits of armor. In that case, you might want to admire their dedication before squishing them. Just a thought. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's talk cavalry. But not, like, that cavalry. We're not talking about slow-motion shots of lances shattering and horses screaming in Hollywood epics. Though, I have to admit, those movies are kinda fun. What if all battles were fought as dance-offs? Think about it. Instead, you're going to trudge through the less glamorous, yet far more nuanced, reality of how cavalry actually operated on the battlefield. Because, spoiler alert, it wasn't always about the decisive charge. Picture this, you're a Roman auxiliary cavalryman, circa the 2nd century AD. You're sweating in your leather armor, the sun beating down on your helmet. Your horse, a sturdy, if somewhat grumpy, Iberian breed, is shifting nervously. You're not about to charge a line of screaming barbarians. Nope. Your job is screening. You're the eyes and ears of the legion. Patrolling the flanks, scouting ahead, making sure no sneaky ambushes ruin everyone's day. Think of yourself as a really expensive, and slightly more intimidating, Uber Eats driver, but for military intel. You scan the horizon, the wind carrying the scent of pine and, is that wood smoke? You squint. Yeah, definitely smoke. You signal to your fellow riders, and you begin a slow, careful approach. You're not looking for a fight, necessarily. You're looking for information. Where are they? How many? What are they up to? And most importantly, can you radio all that information back to your commander before they decide to storm the Roman fort? This kind of scouting was absolutely vital. Roman generals knew they couldn't afford to be caught unawares. A well-placed ambush could decimate even the most disciplined legion. So, the cavalry acted as a mobile shield, providing early warning and allowing the infantry time to prepare. It's like having a really good smoke detector, except instead of annoying beeps, it involves horses and pointy sticks. And sometimes, really bad singing on the long rides. I imagine Roman cavalrymen had some killer campfire songs. Or maybe just a lot of off-key chanting. Mainstream history tells us that the Roman army was a marvel of engineering and logistical efficiency. But that was only possible through effective intelligence gathering, and a large part of that fell to the cavalry. Now, here's a quirky little fact, some Roman cavalry units actually used flaming pigs as a tactical weapon. You heard that right. Pigs. On fire. Apparently, if you set a pig on fire, it tends to run around in a panic, wreaking havoc and generally freaking everyone out, especially elephants. Who knew? It's like a medieval flashbang grenade, but significantly more porcine. Historians still argue whether this was a common tactic or just a desperate measure in a few isolated incidents. But the thought of Roman soldiers chasing flaming pigs around the battlefield is certainly memorable. Let's hop forward a few centuries. You are now a Mongol horse archer. The wind whips across the vast steppe, stinging your face. Your composite bow, a masterpiece of engineering, feels familiar in your hands. You aren't lined up for a head-on collision with heavily armored knights. No, your job is much more artful. Think of yourselves as medieval snipers on horseback. And unlike those heavily armed European knights, you have a massive advantage: stirrups. Stirrups, introduced to Europe around the 8th century, provided riders with much more stability and leverage, particularly for wielding weapons. However, the Mongols took that advantage even further. You ride in loose formations, harassing the enemy flanks, peppering them with arrows. The idea isn't to break their line, but to whittle them down, to provoke them into chasing you, to disrupt their formations. It's like being a really annoying mosquito. Just when they think they've swatted you away, you're back, stinging again. And again. Until they're exhausted, demoralized, and ripe for the picking. This tactic, known as hit and run, was a staple of nomadic warfare for centuries. It relied on speed, mobility, and the devastating accuracy of the composite bow. The Mongol cavalry wasn't about brute force. It was about finesse, about wearing down the enemy psychologically and physically before delivering the final blow. Think of it as psychological warfare, but with arrows. And by the way, some of the Mongols actually practiced falconry, even while on horseback. Imagine that. You're galloping across the steppe, firing arrows, and simultaneously controlling a trained falcon. Talk about multitasking. Historians still debate the full extent of the Mongol Empire's impact on global trade and cultural exchange. But one thing is certain: their mastery of cavalry tactics allowed them to conquer vast swathes of territory with lightning speed. Now, let's rewind a bit and cross the Atlantic. You're a Plains Indian warrior in the 19th century. You sit astride your Mustang, a descendant of horses brought to the Americas by the Spanish. You're not charging into fortified positions. Your mission is to hunt buffalo, to raid enemy camps, to defend your territory. You are an incredibly skilled horseman, practically one with your mount. You can ride bareback at breakneck speed, using your body weight to control your horse with almost telepathic precision. You wield a lance, a bow, or a rifle with deadly accuracy, even while moving at full gallop. The horse transformed Plains Indian culture, turning them into some of the most formidable light cavalry in the world. Hunting became more efficient, warfare more mobile, and the very fabric of their society was reshaped by this magnificent animal. But it wasn't just about brute force. Plains Indian warfare was often a complex dance of raids, ambushes, and skirmishes. Counting coup, touching an enemy without inflicting serious injury, was often considered a greater act of bravery than killing him. It's like a really elaborate game of tag, but with much higher stakes. Now, here's a quirky little tidbit: some Plains Indian tribes used to train their horses to respond to specific vocal commands, even in the heat of battle. Imagine whispering instructions to your horse and having it understand exactly what you want it to do. That's some serious horse whispering skills. Historians still argue about the exact number of buffalo that once roamed the Great Plains, but there's no doubt that the horse played a crucial role in their survival and their eventual near extinction. You might be thinking, okay, I get it. Cavalry wasn't always about charging. But surely, sometimes they did just charge, right? Absolutely. Sometimes, a good, old-fashioned charge was exactly what the situation called for. But even then, it wasn't as simple as just pointing your horse and yelling, "Charge." There was strategy involved, tactics to consider, and a whole lot of planning that went into it. Think about the Battle of Agincourt. Yes, the English longbowmen played a decisive role, but the French knights also charged, and promptly got bogged down in the mud. That wasn't a failure of cavalry in general. That was a failure of tactical execution. Charging into a muddy field against a well-defended position is generally not a recipe for success. And speaking of failures, what do you call a knight who's afraid to fight? Surrender. I'll see myself out. Even in the age of gunpowder, cavalry retained its importance on the battlefield. Dragoons, for example, were mounted infantry who could ride to the battlefield, dismount, and fight as foot soldiers. They combined the mobility of cavalry with the firepower of infantry. It's like having a transformer in your army. Ultimately, the role of cavalry was incredibly diverse and adaptable, changing with the times, the terrain, and the enemy they faced. It was never just about the charge. It was about scouting, screening, harassing, raiding, and, yes, sometimes, charging. It was about speed, mobility, and the ability to exploit opportunities that infantry simply couldn't reach. And it's about remembering those pigs. So, the next time you see a movie about knights charging into battle, remember that there's a whole lot more to the story than meets the eye. And that the true strength of cavalry lay not just in their horses and weapons, but in their versatility, their adaptability, and their ability to think on their hooves. Okay, settle in. Grab your chamomile tea, your weighted blanket, whatever gets you comfy. Because tonight, we're diving deep. Deep into the mud, the stink, the absolute guts of medieval warfare. We're talking about the infantry. Yeah, them. The guys history often forgets, or at least glosses over in favor of shiny, clanky knights. But trust me, you're going to want to hear this. Because let's be honest, those knights. All flash, no substance, sometimes. I mean, sure, they looked impressive, all decked out in their fancy armor, riding those massive warhorses. But who do you think was actually winning the battles? Or, more accurately, doing the majority of the dying? Spoiler alert, it wasn't usually Sir Reginald Fortescue III. You trudged through the knee-deep mud, the chills seeping into your very bones despite the layers of rough-spun wool you're wearing. Rain lashes down, blurring the already indistinct horizon. Ahead, a seemingly endless line of figures stretches out, your comrades. Fellow infantrymen. Each one as miserable and likely terrified as you are. The air smells of wet earth, damp wool, and, is that stale beer? Probably. Morale boosters, courtesy of the local tavern owner, bless his probably sticky heart. You grip your spear tighter, the wood cold and slick in your hand. This is it. This is what medieval warfare really looks like. And while Sir Reginald is polishing his helmet back in the tent, you're the one facing down a wall of enemy pikes. Fun times. Now, a mainstream historical fact for you, the Battle of Crécy in 1346 is a classic example of the infantry's importance. The English longbowmen absolutely decimated the French knights. Decimated. Not just wounded, not just inconvenienced, but straight up, goodbye, world, decimated. But it wasn't just the longbowmen. The English infantry held the line, preventing the French from overwhelming them, even after repeated cavalry charges. They were the anvil against which the French hammer shattered. And that, my friends, is what you call teamwork. And speaking of interesting tidbits, did you know that some medieval armies used caltrops? Those nasty little iron spikes scattered on the ground to cripple horses and, well, anyone unlucky enough to step on them. Talk about low-tech, high-impact weaponry. It's the medieval equivalent of leaving Legos all over the floor. You think knights appreciate having their warhorses suddenly go lame because of a hidden, pointy surprise? I highly doubt it. Historians still argue whether the decline of feudalism was directly caused by the rise of effective infantry tactics, but it's hard to deny the connection. If a well-trained, well-equipped peasant army can consistently defeat heavily armored knights, then the entire social and political structure built on the dominance of those knights starts to crumble. And who wants to pay taxes to someone who can't even protect them from a bunch of farmers with pointy sticks? No one, that's who. You take another step forward, the mud sucking at your boots. The noise of the approaching enemy grows louder, the clatter of armor, the snorting of horses, the war cries that are probably a lot less inspiring when you're actually facing them. Your heart pounds in your chest. You glance around at the faces of your fellow soldiers. Some look grim, some look determined, and some look like they're about to be very, very sick. You try to focus on your training, on the drills you've repeated countless times. Keep the line. Trust your comrades. And try not to die. Easier said than done, really. The thing is, the average medieval peasant turned soldier wasn't exactly a superhero. They weren't born warriors, itching for a fight. Most of them were just farmers, blacksmiths, or bakers dragged away from their fields and forges and told to go kill someone. Imagine being told to swap your sourdough starter for a spear. The pressure. And yet, they did it. They stood their ground, they fought, and sometimes, they even won. Why? Well, partly because they had to. Loyalty to their lord, fear of punishment, the promise of plunder, all these things played a role. But also, I suspect, because they realized they were stronger together. A single peasant might be easily trampled by a knight, but a tightly packed line of spearmen? That's a much tougher proposition. There's power in numbers, especially when those numbers are really, really annoyed. Let's not forget the logistical nightmare of fielding an army of knights. All that fancy armor needs to be made, maintained, and transported. Those warhorses need to be fed, watered, and cared for. And who do you think was doing all that? The infantry. They were the support staff, the quartermasters, the baggage handlers, the cooks, the everything elseers that kept the whole military machine running. They were the medieval equivalent of the guys who set up the chairs at an award ceremony. No one notices them, but without them, the whole thing would fall apart. And here's a quirky tidbit for you: some medieval armies actually employed shield maidens, female warriors who fought alongside the men. Now, this is a bit of a controversial topic. Some historians believe the evidence for their existence is flimsy, based more on legend than reality. Others point to archaeological findings, like Viking graves containing female skeletons buried with weapons, as proof that women did indeed participate in combat. So, take it with a grain of salt. But the image of a woman wielding an axe alongside her male comrades is definitely a cool one. Talk about shattering expectations. Historians still argue whether the medieval period was actually as violent as popular culture suggests. I mean, yes, there were wars and battles, sieges and skirmishes. But there was also farming, trade, art, and philosophy. Life went on, even amidst the chaos. It wasn't all just blood and guts. Though, let's be real, there was definitely a lot of blood and guts. The enemy is almost upon you. You can see their faces now, grim, determined, just like yours. You can hear their shouts, their war cries, their taunts. You can smell the sweat, the fear, the anticipation. This is it. The moment of truth. You brace yourself, lower your spear, and prepare to meet the charge. You're just one man, one insignificant foot soldier. But you're also part of something bigger, something stronger. You're part of the infantry. And you are the backbone of this army. It's funny, we often romanticize the medieval period, focusing on the knights, the castles, the chivalry. We forget about the ordinary people who lived and died during those times. The peasants who toiled in the fields, the merchants who traded in the markets, the soldiers who fought in the wars. They were the unsung heroes of the Middle Ages, the ones who kept the world turning, even when it seemed like it was about to fall apart. And, on the topic of unsung heroes, here's a light joke for you: why did the medieval peasant refuse to play cards? Because he was afraid of getting dealt a bad hand. Imagine the sheer mundanity of being a medieval soldier. Days, weeks, even months spent marching, digging trenches, building fortifications, and foraging for food. And then, suddenly, you're thrust into the middle of a brutal battle, where your life hangs in the balance. It's like going from 0 to 60 in a heartbeat. They say that history is written by the victors. And that's probably true. But I think it's important to remember the stories of the losers too. The ordinary people who fought for causes they believed in, even if they ended up on the losing side. Because their stories are just as important, just as valid, as the stories of the kings and queens and knights. And, since we're being so philosophical, another joke: what do you call a knight who's afraid to fight? Surrender. Okay, let's bring it back to the battlefield. The clash of steel, the screams of the wounded, the thunder of hooves, it's a sensory overload. You push forward, your spear finding its mark. You see an enemy soldier fall, but another takes his place. The fighting is fierce, chaotic, and utterly brutal. You lose sight of your comrades, you're surrounded by the enemy, and you realize that this might be it. This might be the end. But then, something happens. A surge of adrenaline, a burst of anger, a primal instinct to survive. You fight harder, you push back, you refuse to give up. And slowly, inch by inch, you start to gain ground. You see your comrades fighting alongside you, their faces grim but determined. And you realize that you're not alone. You're part of something bigger. You're part of the infantry. And you will not be broken. And here's our final joke: just because you've been such good listeners, what's a medieval knight's favorite fruit? Chainmail-ons. Because seriously, the infantry. They weren't glamorous. They weren't famous. But they were essential. They were the backbone. And without them, the medieval world would have looked very, very different. You trudge forward, the midday sun beating down on your neck. The air hangs thick and heavy, saturated with the mingled scents of dust, sweat, and something vaguely, latrine. Why, welcome to siege warfare, friend. It's not quite the romantic, valiant clash of swords you envision from the history books, is it? More like a slow, agonizing test of wills, and stomachs. Forget the dramatic breaching of walls you see in movies. That's just the climax. The reality of a siege is a protracted, often tedious affair that could drag on for months, even years. Think of it as a medieval staring contest, but with catapults and occasional outbreaks of dysentery. You see, sieges were far more common than pitched battles in medieval warfare. A good, solid castle was a costly and difficult thing to build, and taking one through direct assault was usually suicidal. So, you settle in. You surround the castle. You cut off its supplies. You wait. It's a bit like ordering takeout, except instead of pad thai, you're waiting for starvation to kick in. This wasn't just about brute force either. Logistics were key. Feeding an army in the field, far from your own lands, was a massive undertaking. You needed to keep your soldiers supplied with food, water, weapons, and, perhaps most importantly, beer. A disgruntled, thirsty army is a mutinous army, and nobody wants a mutiny when they're already trying to stranglehold a castle. Think about it. Every day, you need to haul in tons of supplies. Bakers need to bake bread. Brewers need to brew beer. Blacksmiths need to forge weapons. Coopers need to make barrels. And somewhere, someone needs to clean out the latrines. It's an entire mobile city, dedicated to the singular goal of making life miserable for the people inside the walls. And occasionally getting shot at with arrows. Speaking of arrows, you notice a few whizzing past, sticking into the parched earth around you. Time to duck. The defenders aren't just going to sit there and starve quietly. They'll launch sorties, small raiding parties sent out to harass your troops, disrupt your supply lines, and generally make a nuisance of themselves. It's like when you're trying to watch a movie, and your roommate keeps coming in to ask you questions about their day. Annoying, right? Now imagine they have a crossbow. Of course, you're not entirely defenseless either. You have your own archers, and they're busy returning the favor, peppering the walls with arrows. It's a deadly game of cat and mouse, played out against the backdrop of towering stone walls and the ever-present threat of disease. Beyond the archers, the trebuchet is the star of the show. This giant catapult hurls massive stones at the castle walls, slowly but surely pounding them into rubble. It's like a medieval jackhammer, but much, much slower and less efficient. Each shot is a spectacle, a thunderous roar followed by the satisfying crunch of stone on stone. Well, satisfying for you, at least. But what about those inside the walls? What's life like for the besieged? Well, imagine being trapped in your house with a dwindling supply of food, no electricity, and a constant barrage of rocks falling from the sky. Not exactly a picnic, is it? Rations are carefully managed, and soon everyone is eating the absolute bare minimum to survive. Morale plummets. Disease spreads like wildfire in the cramped, unsanitary conditions. And the constant fear of death hangs heavy in the air. It's basically the zombie apocalypse, except the zombies are outside, and they're using siege engines. Sometimes, desperate measures are taken. Cats and dogs disappear. Rats become a delicacy. And in extreme cases, well, let's just say that historical accounts of sieges often include euphemistic references to leather and other unmentionables being consumed. Let's just leave that thought right there, shall we? Historians still argue whether the decline of cannibalism in medieval Europe was linked to improved siege tactics. I mean, probably not, but it's a fun thought, isn't it? There were also more creative methods of defense. Boiling oil was a classic, poured down on attackers attempting to scale the walls. Nasty. Then there were the beehives, launched over the walls to unleash swarms of angry insects on the besiegers. Ouch. And let's not forget the strategically placed latrines, designed to water the invaders with a less than pleasant surprise. You really had to admire their resourcefulness. But the siege isn't just a physical battle, it's a psychological one too. The attackers try to demoralize the defenders, using propaganda and threats to break their spirit. Sometimes, they would catapult the heads of enemy soldiers over the walls, a gruesome message designed to induce surrender. Charming, isn't it? And the defenders, in turn, would try to taunt the besiegers, shouting insults and displaying banners to show their defiance. It was like a very, very long and drawn-out roast battle, but with significantly higher stakes. Of course, not all sieges ended with a bloody assault. Sometimes, a negotiated surrender was possible. Perhaps the defenders realized their situation was hopeless and decided to cut their losses. Or maybe the attackers were running low on supplies and couldn't afford to continue the siege any longer. In these cases, terms would be agreed upon. The defenders might be allowed to leave with their lives and some of their possessions, or they might be taken prisoner and ransomed back to their families. It all depended on the circumstances and the whims of the commanders involved. One quirky little historical detail is that sometimes, sieges were broken not by force, but by bribery. A well-placed bribe could persuade a guard to open a gate, or a disgruntled officer to betray his comrades. It just goes to show you that even in the most brutal conflicts, human nature, and a little bit of cash, can play a significant role. After all, as they say, money makes the world go round, and sometimes it makes castles fall. Mainstream history would note that the Siege of Orleans, during the 100 Years' War, is a famous example of a siege that was ultimately lifted due to the intervention of Joan of Arc. Her arrival boosted the morale of the French defenders and led to a series of successful attacks against the English besiegers. It's one of those iconic moments in history, a testament to the power of belief and leadership. As you sit here, dust coating your throat, a little voice whispers that maybe becoming a jester wouldn't be so bad after all. Sure, the jokes might fall flat sometimes, but at least you wouldn't be dodging arrows and inhaling the aroma of medieval sewage. Plus, you get a cool hat. And maybe, just maybe, you could convince the king to implement mandatory dental hygiene. Now there's a platform I can get behind. But for now, the siege continues. The sun begins to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the battlefield. The air cools slightly, but the stench remains. You pull your blanket tighter around you and try to get some sleep. Tomorrow will be another day of hunger, boredom, and the ever-present threat of death. Just another day in the glamorous world of siege warfare. Sweet dreams. Alright, settle in, pull up a cushion, and let's chat about something really exciting, well, exciting for medieval accountants, anyway. We're talking about logistics, baby. Specifically, the gargantuan, migraine-inducing headache that was feeding a medieval army. Imagine this, you trudge alongside thousands of other soldiers, the sun beating down on your helmet, the smell of unwashed bodies thick in the air. You're hungry. Very hungry. But where is your next meal coming from? It's not like there's a McDonald's every 5 miles. This, my friend, is where the logistical magic, or should I say, the logistical nightmare, begins. See, armies don't run on morale alone, despite what your inspirational general might tell you before a battle. They run on food. Lots and lots of food. We're talking about tons of grain, salted meat that could double as a medieval weapon, and enough ale to float a small ship. Feeding these blokes, and their horses, donkeys, and various camp followers, was a Herculean task. A common estimate, and by no means precise, is that each soldier needed about a kilogram of food per day. Now multiply that by, say, a modest army of 10,000 men, and don't forget the animals, and you're suddenly dealing with 10 tons of food daily. That's a lot of grub to cart around. Good thing they didn't have dietary restrictions back then. Gluten-free wasn't a battle cry. So, how did they do it? Well, it wasn't a single solution. It was more a mix-and-match strategy of foraging, requisitioning, that's a fancy word for, taking stuff, and good old-fashioned supply trains. Foraging was definitely the first option. Armies, especially smaller raiding parties, would try to live off the land. Think of it as medieval, farm-to-table, just a bit more, impromptu. Soldiers would fan out, looking for anything edible, crops from fields, animals to hunt, assuming they could catch them before someone else did, and even wild berries. It's like a really stressful picnic. This approach was quick and easy, but it also made you super unpopular with the local population, especially when you foraged their prize-winning pig. And therein lies the problem with foraging, it tends to deplete local resources pretty darn quickly. It only works when moving through rich, unplundered lands, and it makes you really, really good at creating enemies. You can't just roll into a town, take all their food, and expect them to wave goodbye with a smile. Well, I guess you could, but you'd better be ready for some resistance. Requisitioning, on the other hand, was a slightly more formal version of looting. I say slightly, because it was still basically looting, just with a piece of paper and maybe a promise to pay, eventually. Royal officials would issue decrees demanding supplies from towns and villages in the army's path. It was basically a medieval invoice. Of course, getting those supplies wasn't always easy. Sometimes, villages would hide their food, hoping the army would pass them by. Other times, let's just say they'd misunderstand the amount requested. Historians still argue whether this resistance was common or just anecdotal, but I'm willing to bet a few farmers gave their invading overlords the runaround. I picture some poor clerk trying to negotiate how many chickens count as a sackful, with a cunning old farmer who suddenly can't count past 5. Good luck with that, pal. But the real heavy lifting, literally, was done by the supply trains. These were vast convoys of wagons, carts, and pack animals, loaded down with everything an army needed to survive. Think of them as the Amazon Prime delivery service of the Middle Ages, only much, much slower and infinitely less reliable. And what did they carry? Mostly things that could be stored for a long time without spoiling. Grain, of course, was the staple, usually in the form of wheat or barley. This could be ground into flour and baked into bread, or cooked into a simple porridge. Salted meat, usually pork or beef, was another essential, though it was often so heavily salted that you practically needed a gallon of ale to wash it down. Hardtack, a type of twice-baked biscuit, was also popular. It was basically indestructible, although breaking your teeth on it was a distinct possibility. And of course, you had to have ale, or wine, or whatever local brew was available to keep the soldiers hydrated, and perhaps a bit more agreeable. The scale of these supply trains was staggering. They could stretch for miles, creating a tempting target for bandits and enemy raiders. Protecting them was a major undertaking, requiring significant manpower. And moving them was a logistical nightmare, especially over rough terrain. Imagine trying to navigate a muddy track with hundreds of wagons pulled by oxen. Good luck not ending up axle-deep in muck. The logistical teams were probably not getting paid enough for that. Even the most carefully planned supply lines could break down. Bad weather, enemy action, and plain old mismanagement could all lead to shortages. And when the food ran out, things could get ugly, fast. Morale would plummet, desertions would increase, and discipline would, let's just say it would become a suggestion, rather than an order. A hungry army is a dangerous army, and not just to its enemies. There were also some rather creative solutions to the problem of feeding an army. Some armies, particularly those operating in coastal areas, would rely on ships to bring supplies. Others would simply buy food from local merchants, assuming there were any willing to sell to them. And then there were the less savory options, like, well, let's just say that rats and stray dogs sometimes ended up in the cooking pot. I'm not going to elaborate on that, just imagine the possibilities. One fringe theory suggests that some medieval armies employed teams of trained squirrels to gather nuts and seeds. The idea is that these squirrels could be released into forests and fields, where they would diligently collect food for the army. While the image is hilarious, and perhaps a bit heartwarming, I'm reasonably confident there's no primary evidence to back this up. But hey, a man can dream, right? Imagine a regiment of heavily armed squirrels, bravely gathering acorns for the war effort. So, the next time you're enjoying a nice, hot meal, take a moment to appreciate the sheer effort that goes into feeding an army. Today, it's a complex web of trucks, trains, and airplanes. Back in the Middle Ages, it was an even more complex web of wagons, oxen, and a whole lot of luck. And don't forget the poor medieval quartermaster, pulling his hair out trying to make sure everyone got enough to eat. He truly deserved a medal, and a really strong drink. Or maybe a trained squirrel. Alright, settle in, friend. Find that comfy spot on the couch, maybe grab a warm drink. We're diving deep today, real deep, into something you might not think about much when you're watching those epic battle scenes in movies. We're talking about dirt. Rocks. Hills. You know, terrain. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. Terrain. Sounds boring. But trust me on this one. Terrain isn't just window dressing, it's not just a pretty backdrop for clashing swords. It's a silent, often overlooked, player on the battlefield. A weapon in disguise. And sometimes, it's the most important weapon. Imagine yourself. You're a Roman legionary, right? You've spent months marching, eating hardtack that could double as a brick, and sweating in that ridiculously impractical armor. You crest a hill, finally expecting to see the enemy. And there they are, those barbarian hordes, arrayed below you. But something's off. The ground slopes downwards, a gentle, deceptive incline. You and your buddies, you all begin to trudge downwards, you're getting faster and faster. Before you know it, your shield, it gets heavy and difficult to hold. Suddenly, your normally impeccable formation is all messed up as you start picking up more speed. The ground gives way under your feet. What looks easy on the map is turning into an exercise in not faceplanting. Before you know it, you hit the bottom and find yourself in a disorganized mess. The barbarians come barreling towards you and smash into you. That, my friend, is terrain making its play. A simple slope turned into a tactical advantage. See, armies in the ancient world were all about formations. The Roman legions, with their tight shield walls and disciplined ranks, were masters of controlled movement. But that control depended on solid, even ground. A slope, a marsh, a forest, anything that disrupted that formation could break their power. Fun fact, you know they are supposed to stand shoulder to shoulder so the enemy can't pass through their ranks. When disrupted by terrain, they become vulnerable. Consider the Battle of Teutoburg Forest. You probably know it. It's the Roman humiliation. The forest was so thick that it allowed the Germanic tribes to surprise the Romans. Historians still argue whether the Germanic tribes were lucky or if they deliberately led the Romans into the terrain. The Roman column, stretched out for miles, was ambushed in the dense woods. They couldn't deploy effectively, their formations were useless, and the barbarians, who knew the terrain intimately, just picked them apart. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about where the battle took place. It was a total disaster for the Romans. And get this, they even brought their wives and children along for the ride. Imagine trying to fight off a barbarian horde while simultaneously keeping an eye on your toddlers. Now, fast forward a few centuries. We're in medieval Europe. Castles are all the rage, and everyone's busy trying to knock them down. And where do you think they built those castles? On hills, baby. On high ground overlooking valleys. Why? Because it's harder to attack uphill. You try charging up a steep slope in full armor. It's exhausting. It leaves you exposed. Your attackers have to shoot their arrows upwards. The angle is difficult. Your defender gets to drop boiling oil on you, or maybe just chuck rocks. It gives the defenders a huge advantage. Think about it. A castle on flat ground is just a big, fancy target. But a castle perched on a hill? Now you're talking. Plus, the location also dictated the type of castle. A motte and bailey, the classic wooden castle on a raised mound, was a quick and dirty way to fortify a strategic location. A grand stone fortress, on the other hand, took years to build and was meant to project power and control over the surrounding landscape. One was cheap. The other was like building your own personal, heavily armed monument to yourself. You see, terrain influences everything: tactics, strategy, even architecture. But it's not just about hills and forests. Water features can be just as important. Remember the Battle of Agincourt? The English army, outnumbered and facing the might of the French knights, won a stunning victory. How? Partly because of the terrain. Heavy rain had turned the battlefield into a muddy quagmire. The French knights, weighed down by their armor, got bogged down in the mud. They were sitting ducks for the English archers, who unleashed volley after volley of arrows. Those French knights became pincushions because they were stuck in the mud. Fun fact, mud is actually considered a non-Newtonian fluid, meaning that it changes viscosity under pressure. It becomes more like a liquid under stress. That makes it even more difficult to move through when under stress of battle. So that mud was actively working against the French knights, sucking them down, making them less effective. You know, it's moments like Agincourt that make you wonder, how many battles have been decided not by brilliant generals or brave soldiers, but by something as simple as a rain shower. That is why historians still argue whether the Battle of Agincourt was an English victory or a French defeat. And it's not just medieval battles, either. Fast forward to the American Revolution. Think about the Battle of Bunker Hill. The colonial militia, poorly equipped and outnumbered, held off repeated British assaults from the high ground. They inflicted heavy casualties on the British troops who were exposed to the militia. The Americans eventually ran out of ammunition, but they had given the British a bloody nose. It was a major morale boost for the colonists. It demonstrated that they could stand up to the mighty British army. The British learned that it wasn't easy to just walk all over those Americans. Of course, there's a quirky footnote to that battle. The colonial militia were famously ordered, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." Why? Because they were short on ammunition, and they wanted to make every shot count. Can you imagine the tension? Standing there, muskets raised, waiting for the enemy to get close enough to see their eyes. It takes guts. Now, let's jump ahead again, this time to World War II. Think about the Eastern Front. The vast, open steppes of Russia. The harsh winters. The dense forests. The terrain played a huge role in the outcome of that conflict. The Germans, used to fighting in the relatively compact battlefields of Western Europe, found themselves bogged down in the endless expanses of Russia. Their tanks got stuck in the mud during the spring thaw. The bitter cold of winter froze their equipment and their soldiers. The terrain was just as much an enemy as the Red Army. You see, the terrain dictates everything. It dictates how you move, how you fight, even how you supply your troops. A perfectly planned offensive can fall apart if you can't get your tanks across a river, or your supplies through a mountain pass. This is a logistical nightmare. And it's not just about the natural environment. Man-made terrain can be just as important. Think about the Maginot Line, the massive defensive fortifications built by France before World War II. They were designed to deter a German invasion. They were impenetrable, right? Wrong. The Germans just went around them, through the Ardennes forest. The Maginot Line was a testament to the power of terrain. But it was also a testament to the importance of thinking outside the box. The French had focused on fortifying a specific area, but they had neglected to consider other possibilities. The Germans had anticipated the flaw and exploited it. It goes to show that even the most impressive defenses can be rendered useless by a clever enemy and a little bit of imagination. Also that you can't rely only on the Maginot Line. Historians still argue whether the construction of the Maginot Line was a strategic success or failure. So, the next time you're watching a war movie, pay attention to the background. Don't just focus on the explosions and the battles. Look at the hills, the forests, the rivers. Consider how the terrain is affecting the movements of the armies, the tactics they're using, and the outcome of the battle. You might be surprised at what you notice. Terrain is more than just scenery. It's a weapon, a tool, and a silent partner in every conflict. It's the dirt beneath our feet, shaping history one battle at a time. And just like that, we've made it to the end. Alright, settle in, grab your favorite blanket, yes, even in July, because we're diving deep into the surprisingly complex world of medieval military leadership. Forget the shining armor and perfectly coiffed hair, we're talking about the real deal, the folks who manage to, sometimes, drag armies kicking and screaming to victory. You're not just reading about it, you are a medieval soldier, trudging along a muddy road somewhere in France, circa 1350. The sun beats down on your helmet, the wool tunic itches like crazy, and all you can think about is whether the next village will have decent ale. Your leader, Lord Jeff, rides ahead, seemingly oblivious to your suffering. But is he oblivious? Or is there more to him than meets the eye? You squint. Jeff's not exactly a charismatic figure. He's got a paunch threatening to escape his belt, and his battle standard is, well, let's just say his wife clearly has very different artistic talents than he does. But you notice he pauses occasionally, scanning the horizon, a habit he picked up from his old man. He actually listens to the scouts, instead of yelling at them like some other nobles you've seen in action. This observation is good because one mainstream historical fact is that medieval armies often relied heavily on scouts for information about terrain and enemy movements. He also cracks a joke now and then to the foot soldiers, who look like they could drop dead at any second. It's something, I guess. Now, you'd think that the best medieval leaders were just the biggest, strongest, bravest guys on the battlefield, right? Think again. Sure, physical prowess helped, but it was often their mind that made the difference. A commander who charged headfirst into the enemy ranks without a plan was more likely to get himself, and his army, killed than to win a battle. Think of it as a giant game of chess, only with significantly more opportunities to be stabbed in the back, literally. Also, the pieces don't listen half the time. And while we're on the subject of chess, consider this quirky tidbit. Some historians believe that the game of chess itself evolved from earlier war games designed to train military leaders in strategy and tactics. Kind of like a medieval version of StarCraft, only without the Zerg rush. Or maybe more like a really intense game of checkers, and the kings are just better at yelling at people. Communication was key. You might think that yelling, "Charge," was all it took, but effective leaders needed to be able to convey complex plans, coordinate different units, and inspire their troops. It's why we still call some sergeants Sarge, you know. That said, even if they didn't say much, the presence of a strong leader could be enough. The army would rally, the line would solidify, and the enemy would either flee or die. It sounds easy when I say it like that, huh? Well, no. The main difficulty here is that it all had to be done without modern technology. No radios, no GPS, no fancy satellite imagery. Your main tools were banners, horns, messengers on horseback, and the sheer force of your own personality. A strong personality was no guarantee of victory, though. A good leader also needed to understand logistics. Supplying an army in the field was a monumental task. Food, water, weapons, armor, horses, even things like cooking pots and tents, all had to be transported, stored, and distributed efficiently. A leader who neglected logistics was setting his army up for disaster. Think about it, a hungry, thirsty, poorly equipped army is not a happy army. And an unhappy army is much more likely to mutiny or desert. Nobody wants to be stuck in the middle of nowhere with nothing to eat but hardtack and a nagging feeling that your commander has no clue what he's doing. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so these guys needed to be smart, organized, and inspiring. Got it. But what about the whole being brave thing? Well, bravery certainly wasn't a disadvantage. But it wasn't necessarily the most important quality. A reckless commander who constantly put himself in harm's way might win a few battles, but he was also increasing his chances of getting killed or captured. And a dead or captured commander is not a very effective leader. The best leaders understood the importance of calculated risk. They knew when to be aggressive, when to be defensive, and when to retreat. They weren't afraid to take chances, but they also weren't afraid to back down when the odds were stacked against them. You know, there's actually evidence that King Richard III's death at the Battle of Bosworth Field was partially due to his reckless bravery. He charged deep into enemy lines, which might have been inspiring, but ultimately left him isolated and vulnerable. You should have just hung back, dude. Speaking of getting captured, that reminds me of a quirky, and somewhat disturbing, tidbit. In some cases, captured knights were ransomed back to their families, only to find that their families couldn't afford the ransom. The result? They were often left to rot in dungeons, or sold into slavery. Talk about a rough day. So, what makes a bad medieval leader? Well, arrogance and inflexibility were definitely high on the list. A commander who was too proud to listen to his advisors, or too stubborn to adapt to changing circumstances, was doomed to failure. As were commanders who let the loot get to their heads. A commander who cared more about lining his own pockets than about the welfare of his troops was not likely to inspire loyalty or dedication. No, the army does not appreciate you buying yourself a new saddle when they're eating horse meat. And here's where we get into the murky waters of open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether some commanders were truly incompetent, or simply victims of bad luck. Was the Battle of Crécy a testament to Edward III's brilliance, or a lucky break thanks to the English longbow? Was the French defeat at Agincourt due to poor leadership, or simply the result of muddy terrain and a series of unfortunate events? The answer, as always, is probably somewhere in between. After all, battles are chaotic, unpredictable affairs. Even the best-laid plans can go awry. And, let's be honest, sometimes things happen that were just plain bizarre. Remember the Great Emu War in Australia? Yeah, well, something similar happened in medieval Europe, sort of. During the Battle of Barnet in 1471, the Earl of Oxford's forces mistakenly fired on their own allies, causing widespread confusion and contributing to the Yorkist victory. Friendly fire, medieval style. Which is to say, even more confusing. Ultimately, leadership in the medieval period was a complex and multifaceted affair. It required a blend of intelligence, charisma, courage, and organizational skills. The best leaders were not just brave warriors, they were also shrewd strategists, skilled diplomats, and effective administrators. They understood the needs of their troops, the strengths and weaknesses of their enemies, and the importance of logistics and communication. In short, they were the ones who managed to turn a bunch of unruly, often reluctant, individuals into a cohesive and effective fighting force. And that, my friends, is no small feat now. Get some rest. You've earned it. Right, settle in, settle in. Let's keep going, shall we? Comfy? Good. Because what comes next? Well, it ain't a tea party, that's for sure. You trudge. Boots heavy, each step a sticky pull against the mud. It's not the heroic charge you envisioned, not the glorious advance from the recruitment posters. This isn't some romantic painting, it's the leftover stew, 3 days after the feast. Gray sky hangs low, heavy like a waterlogged blanket. And the smell, gods, the smell. It's a cocktail of mud, burnt powder, and something else. Something, Swedish. Decomposing. Yeah, try not to breathe too deeply, okay? You'll get used to it. Ish. Around you, the battlefield lies still, a discarded plaything of some angry god. Broken trees claw at the sky, their limbs snap like twigs. Craters pockmark the earth, each a muddy grave waiting to happen. And scattered, everywhere, are the remnants. Bits of uniform, shattered weapons, personal effects spilled like unwanted secrets. A photograph, face down in the mud. A tattered letter, stained crimson. Half a playing card, the Queen of Hearts staring blankly at the uncaring heavens. It's quiet now, deathly quiet, save for the rasping breath of the wounded and the occasional distant groan. Earlier, it was a symphony of screams, explosions, and the brutal staccato of gunfire. You try to block it out, really you do, but it echoes, a phantom orchestra playing a macabre waltz inside your skull. Take it from me, investing in noise-canceling headphones probably would be a good idea. If you had them. You stumble over something. Not something, someone. A soldier, face down, his uniform ripped, a dark stain blooming across his back. You don't look too closely. You can't. You keep moving. Got to keep moving. You see figures moving slowly across the field, like ants on a carcass. They're the burial details, or what's left of them. Their job. Gather the dead. Identification. If possible. Dig the mass graves. A quick prayer. Done. Not exactly dignified, is it? But when you're dealing with hundreds, thousands even, dignity becomes a luxury. A luxury you can't afford. Historically speaking, mass graves have been a battlefield constant for as long as there have been battlefields. The Battle of Alesia in 52 BC, where Julius Caesar laid siege to a Gallic fortress. Pits overflowing with the fallen, Roman and Gaul alike. The Somme. Enough bodies to fertilize the fields for a century, morbidly speaking. It's a grim arithmetic, ex-soldiers enter. Why soldiers return? The remainder go, under. And speaking of grim, did you know that in some armies, soldiers were issued with numbered teeth? Sounds crazy, right? The idea was that if a body was too mangled to identify, they could match the teeth to records and at least give the poor soul a name. Practical? Sure. Slightly terrifying? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether the sheer scale of battlefield casualties in the modern era has fundamentally altered our perception of war. Has the industrialization of death numbed us? Or does it make us more aware of the human cost? Yeah, I don't have an answer for that one. Probably need a philosophy professor for that. Or maybe just a stiff drink. The wounded. You pass a medic tending to a soldier, his leg a mangled mess. The medic's face is grim, efficient. Amputation? Likely. A quick tourniquet, a shot of morphine, and then on to the next. He doesn't have time for tears, or platitudes, or even a kind word. Just survival. Raw, desperate survival. And there's the shell-shocked. Soldiers staring blankly into the distance, their eyes hollow, their minds, gone. They don't react to your presence, don't even seem to notice you. They're trapped in a loop of terror, reliving the horrors over and over again. They'll be the lucky ones if they eventually find their way back to something resembling normal. Many won't. Post-traumatic stress, or shell shock as it was known then, wasn't really understood for a long time. Soldiers were branded as cowards, shirkers, even mentally deficient. Can you imagine? Now, of course, we know it's a real, debilitating condition. But back then, a lot of these guys were simply left to rot, forgotten casualties of a war that kept right on fighting. You notice a bird, a small sparrow, perched on a shattered artillery piece. It pecks at the ground, seemingly oblivious to the carnage around it. A flicker of life in this landscape of death. You watch it for a moment, a small, fragile reminder that the world keeps turning, even when humanity seems determined to destroy itself. Kinda poetic, huh? Although, probably just looking for worms. Looting. You see soldiers picking through the bodies, searching for valuables. Rings, watches, wallets. Not exactly honorable, is it? But war strips away a lot of things, including honor. Some do it out of necessity, needing something to trade for food or supplies. Others? Pure greed. One soldier even has a pair of boots he's trying to pull off of a, well, never mind. Speaking of questionable practices, did you know that during some wars, soldiers would collect teeth as trophies? Particularly gold teeth. It was seen as a sign of, well, I don't know. Strength? Dominance? Just plain creepiness? Either way, it's enough to make you want to brush twice a day. Historians still argue whether looting on the battlefield represents a complete moral collapse, or simply a pragmatic response to desperate circumstances. Maybe it's both. Maybe war just reveals the darkest aspects of human nature. Like a particularly unpleasant biopsy. You keep walking. The sun begins to set, casting long, eerie shadows across the battlefield. The air grows colder, the silence deeper. You reach a makeshift camp, a cluster of tents huddled together in a relative patch of dryness. A fire crackles, casting flickering light on the faces of the survivors. Tired faces. Dirty faces. Haunted faces. You find a spot near the fire, drop your pack, and sit. The warmth is welcome, but it doesn't reach the chill in your bones. You pull out your mess kit and open a can of something. Tastes vaguely like beef. Or maybe it's horse. Or maybe it's just something. You eat it anyway. You're too tired to care. Around you, soldiers are talking, mostly in hushed tones. Recounting the battle, remembering the fallen, trying to make sense of the senseless. Most conversations quickly devolve into, "Wish I was home," or "I'm never doing that again." A few are crying softly, their faces buried in their hands. Others stare silently into the fire, lost in their own private hells. Did you know that during World War I, many soldiers developed a fondness for trench rats? Yeah, rats. They were everywhere, of course, and some soldiers even named them, kept them as pets. Sounds crazy, right? But in that environment of death and destruction, any source of companionship, no matter how unlikely, was a welcome one. You close your eyes, trying to block out the sights, the smells, the sounds. But it's no use. The battlefield is inside you now, etched into your memory, a permanent scar on your soul. But hey, at least you have an exciting story to tell at parties. Historians still argue whether it's possible to ever truly forget the experience of combat. Can the human mind ever fully process the trauma of war? Maybe. Maybe not. I wish you luck. I am now going to fall asleep. Good night. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's dim the lights a little, maybe grab a lukewarm cup of something soothing. Today we're wading into the messy, often misremembered, world of famous battles. You ever notice how History Channel reenactments always seem to have perfect weather? Spoiler alert, it wasn't. So, let's peel back the layers of legend and get to the slightly less glorious, but definitely more real, stories lurking beneath. You're going to like this. You find yourself standing on a windswept hill overlooking a valley. It's 1066, and down below, at Hastings, two armies are about to clash. You can practically feel the tension in the air, the nervous energy radiating off the Norman and Saxon soldiers. William the Conqueror, a name that just screams future property magnate, is about to try his luck at becoming the King of England. You squint. The sun's glinting off chainmail, and you can hear the clang of metal on metal already. Now, a pretty mainstream fact, the Battle of Hastings changed the course of English history forever. You know, Normans, French influence, the whole shebang. But here's the quirky bit, did you know that William's invasion was actually almost called off at the last minute because his flagship sprang a leak? Seriously. Imagine if England had been saved by a faulty hull sealant. Talk about anticlimactic. You watch as the Norman archers let loose a volley of arrows. According to legend, one of those arrows struck King Harold Godwin's son in the eye, leading to his demise. That's the image everyone remembers, right? But historians still argue whether Harold was actually killed by an arrow. Some suggest he was cut down by Norman knights, and the arrow to the eye story was later embellished for dramatic effect. I mean, it is a great story. But you have to wonder what actually happened in those final few moments. It's quite a visual though, eye-catching, one might say. You trudge forward a few centuries now. The year is 1415, and you're knee-deep in the muddy fields of Agincourt. It's raining. Of course, it's raining. Remember what I said about perfect weather? Forget it. This is miserable. You're surrounded by knights in shining, but probably now quite muddy, armor. The English, led by Henry V, are facing a much larger French army. One mainstream fact to remember is that Agincourt is celebrated as a major English victory, largely due to Henry V's leadership and the effectiveness of the English longbowmen. They were basically the sniper rifle of the medieval period. But here's the quirky part, French knights were so weighed down by their armor that many of them literally got stuck in the mud and were unable to fight. I can imagine the scene, an army of frustrated, heavily armored men flailing around in the muck like upturned turtles. Not exactly the picture of chivalry, is it? Kind of makes you feel bad for them. They were just trying to do their jobs and got taken out by poor terrain. You observe the chaos. The English longbowmen rained down arrows on the French, creating havoc and panic. Some believe the English victory was due to divine intervention. Seriously, they thought God was on their side. I guess he wasn't a fan of the French that day. But historians still argue whether the English victory was primarily due to superior tactics, the terrain, or sheer dumb luck. Sometimes, you know, things just happen. Maybe Henry V just brought good biscuits that day and raised morale. Food for thought. You find yourself transported forward again, this time to the scorching deserts of Egypt in 1798. You can practically taste the sand in the air. It's the Battle of the Pyramids, and Napoleon Bonaparte is facing the Mamluk army. A mainstream fact here, Napoleon's victory at the Battle of the Pyramids was a crucial step in his Egyptian campaign, allowing him to seize control of Cairo and further his ambitions in the region. He loved a good pyramid, that guy. But here's the quirky detail, Napoleon reportedly told his troops before the battle, soldiers, from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you. Which is a pretty epic line, right? Except the pyramids weren't quite that tall. And they definitely weren't looking down on anyone, seeing as they were, you know, inanimate objects. But hey, who needs accuracy when you're trying to inspire your troops? I'm sure the sentiment was appreciated. You watch as the French troops, armed with muskets and cannons, systematically decimate the Mamluk cavalry. They didn't stand a chance. The Mamluks, brave as they were armed with swords and spears. It was like bringing a knife to a gunfight, literally. Some historians claim that Napoleon exaggerated the scale of the victory in his reports back to France, wanting to further his own personal image. And others believe it wasn't so one-sided. But historians still argue whether the Battle of the Pyramids was a truly decisive victory or a propaganda stunt blown out of proportion. It's hard to know what to believe, isn't it? Now, let's leap ahead to 1863, and you're standing amidst the carnage of Gettysburg. The air is thick with smoke and the screams of wounded soldiers. This one's intense. A mainstream fact that even your grandma probably knows: Gettysburg was a turning point in the American Civil War, marking the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. But here's a quirky little detail: during the battle, a local woman named Jenny Wade was killed by a stray bullet while baking bread in her kitchen. She's considered the only civilian casualty of the battle, and her house still stands today. Imagine, just trying to bake a loaf of bread and ending up a historical footnote. Talk about bad luck. You witnessed the Confederate charge on Cemetery Ridge, a desperate attempt to break the Union lines. It was a truly valiant, but ultimately doomed effort. The Union soldiers held their ground, repelling wave after wave of Confederate attacks. Some attribute the Union victory to superior numbers and artillery. Others believe it was the result of poor Confederate leadership. But historians still argue whether Gettysburg was truly inevitable or if a different outcome was possible with different decisions. Did the South have a chance? Or was it a lost cause? I guess we will never know for sure. Finally, let's jump to the frozen fields outside of Stalingrad in 1942. You shiver, even though you're just imagining it. This is brutal. The Eastern Front of World War II was a truly horrific theater of war. A mainstream fact that shouldn't be forgotten: the Battle of Stalingrad was a pivotal battle in World War II, marking a turning point on the Eastern Front and leading to the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Here's the quirky bit: during the siege, rats became a major problem for both sides. They gnawed on supplies, spread disease, and generally made life even more miserable than it already was. Seriously, imagine fighting a desperate battle for survival, while also being terrorized by hordes of ravenous rodents. The stuff of nightmares, really. If only they had Pied Pipers back then. You observe the brutal street fighting, the desperate struggle for every building and every inch of ground. It was a war of attrition, a battle of wills. The German army, initially confident, found themselves trapped in a city that had become a death trap. Some historians emphasize the importance of the Soviet counteroffensive, which encircled the German Sixth Army. Others highlight the role of the harsh winter conditions, which decimated the German troops. But historians still argue whether Stalingrad was primarily a military defeat or a symbol of the moral bankruptcy of the Nazi regime. Either way, it's not great. And there you have it, a brief, slightly sarcastic, and hopefully somewhat informative tour of some famous battles. You made it. You probably learned something new, or at least reaffirmed some things you already knew. Now, it's time for a mug of chamomile tea, and maybe some rain sounds. Sleep well, eventually. Alright, settle in, friend. Let's dim the lights a bit, maybe light a lavender candle, purely for ambience, of course, definitely not trying to mask the questionable aroma of that aged cheese you've been hoarding. Today, we're diving headfirst into the beautifully bizarre, sometimes brutal, world of the medieval mindset. Think knights, think castles, think surprisingly complex motivations. You trudge through a muddy field, the weight of your chainmail pressing down. It's heavier than your student loan debt, and arguably just as likely to cripple you. You glance up. The sun is a hazy disk through the perpetual gray, and the air hangs thick with the promise of rain, or, more likely, more mud. This isn't some Renaissance fair fantasy. This is 11th century Europe, and you, my friend, are about to understand what makes these medieval warriors tick. First, let's talk honor. It wasn't just a fancy word embroidered on a tapestry, it was the backbone of their entire existence. You uphold your vows, you protect the weak, mostly, you don't back down from a challenge, even if that challenge is a particularly grumpy badger with a penchant for biting ankles. Because that's honor, see? Standing up for what? Well, for what someone with more land and influence tells you is right. A lord's word was his bond, and breaking that bond was a fast track to social oblivion, if not outright execution. Think of it like medieval Twitter, but instead of getting ratioed, you get beheaded. The stakes were slightly higher. Chivalry, the code of conduct associated with knighthood, wasn't always about rescuing damsels in distress, although that did happen, occasionally. Primarily, it was about regulating violence within the noble class. No point in everyone just killing each other willy-nilly, right? It was more like a set of gentlemen's agreements, outlining how to stab each other in a somewhat civilized manner. Historians still argue whether chivalry was a genuine force for good or merely a veneer of respectability masking ruthless ambition. But it certainly made for good stories, which is all that really matters, isn't it? Now, about that faith thing. It's impossible to overstate the influence of the church in medieval life. It was interwoven into literally everything: politics, economics, social structures, even your chances of getting a decent harvest. The church dictated not only your spiritual path but also your daily routine. Mass every Sunday, or else, confession for your sins, even the ones you're still planning to commit, and, of course, tithes, because God apparently needed a new solid gold chalice. Imagine the psychological weight of that constant surveillance. You truly believe that your eternal soul hung in the balance with every decision. Every war, every famine, every plague, it was all interpreted through a religious lens. Victory was a sign of divine favor. Defeat? Well, you probably just weren't praying hard enough. Or maybe someone was secretly a heretic. Time for another witch hunt. Just kidding, mostly. Weirdly enough, one popular, and slightly unsettling, belief was that certain saints could actually cause illnesses to show their displeasure. So, if you suddenly came down with a nasty bout of the plague, you might be more inclined to blame Saint whoever than, say, the hordes of disease-ridden rats scurrying through your house. Talk about shifting the blame. Let's not forget the Crusades. Talk about a faith-fueled frenzy. Thousands of Europeans, driven by religious zeal, and the promise of plunder, let's be honest, marched eastward to reclaim the Holy Land. It was a complex and brutal series of conflicts, fueled by religious fervor, political ambition, and a healthy dose of xenophobia. You can almost see the appeal, right? A chance to prove your faith, earn salvation, and maybe pick up a few souvenirs along the way. Plus, all that traveling would have been a nice break from the endless mud. And then there's war. Constant, grinding, ever-present war. It was the rhythm of medieval life. Raids, sieges, pitched battles, it was all part of the game, a very deadly and inconvenient game. Land was power, and acquiring land usually involved hacking someone else to pieces. The idea of nation-states, as we understand them today, was still very much in its infancy. Loyalties were often fluid, shifting alliances were commonplace, and your neighbor was just as likely to be your enemy as your friend. Now, before you start picturing these warriors as bloodthirsty psychopaths, remember they were, for the most part, just trying to survive. War was often seen as a necessary evil, a way to protect your family, your community, and your livelihood. It was also a way to gain social status. Glory on the battlefield could lead to land, titles, and the respect of your peers. Which, in a society where social mobility was about as easy as climbing a greased pole in full armor, was a pretty big deal. One of the more curious historical footnotes involves the use of war pigs during sieges. Apparently, coating pigs in flammable substances and setting them loose near enemy fortifications was considered a viable military tactic. The logic, presumably, was that the screaming, burning pigs would sow chaos and terror amongst the defenders. A little cruel, perhaps, but undeniably effective. Unless, of course, the wind shifted and the flaming pigs ran back towards your lines. The psychological toll of constant warfare must have been immense. Imagine the constant fear of death, the trauma of witnessing violence, the moral ambiguity of taking a life. Today, we have PTSD. Back then, they probably just called it battle weariness and told you to suck it up and go pray. Historians still debate whether the medieval period was actually more violent than other eras. We certainly hear more about the battles and sieges, thanks to dramatic chronicles and surviving accounts, but modern conflicts can be just as brutal, albeit with far more sophisticated weaponry. Perhaps the medieval mind accepted violence as an inherent part of life, a constant threat that had to be faced head-on. Or maybe they were all just really, really good at repressing their emotions. Beyond the battlefield, everyday life was also a struggle. Famine, disease, and poverty were constant companions. The average life expectancy was shockingly low. A good harvest could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Basic sanitation was, well, let's just say it left something to be desired. You were constantly battling the elements, the environment, and the ever-present threat of illness. So, maybe that whole honor and faith thing wasn't just about grand ideals. Maybe it was also about finding a way to cope with a world that was often harsh, unforgiving, and just plain unpleasant. Perhaps the key to understanding the medieval mindset is to realize that they lived in a world vastly different from our own. A world where magic and superstition were intertwined with science and reason. A world where the church held sway over every aspect of life. A world where violence was commonplace, and death was always lurking just around the corner. They were driven by a potent mix of faith, fear, ambition, and a desperate desire to find meaning and purpose in a world that often seemed senseless. So, the next time you find yourself complaining about your Wi-Fi being slow or your latte being lukewarm, just take a moment to consider the lives of those medieval warriors. They may not have had access to streaming services or pumpkin spice everything, but they had something that we often lack, a sense of unwavering conviction, a deep-seated belief in something bigger than themselves. And maybe, just maybe, that's something worth envying. Even if it does come with a side of mud and chainmail rash. Well, that's about all the medieval musings I can muster for tonight. I hope you found that mildly informative, vaguely entertaining, and sufficiently soporific. Now, go forth and contemplate the existential dread of medieval peasants, and maybe wash that cheese plate. Sweet dreams, or at least, dreams that don't involve burning pigs. Okay, settle in, grab a blanket, maybe a warm drink. We're going on a journey, a historical snooze cruise, if you will, through the oh-so-relaxing topic of warfare. That's right, warfare. Don't worry, no sudden loud noises, just the gentle murmur of history washing over you. Think Bob Ross, but with slightly more trebuchets. So, picture this, you're a Neolithic farmer, probably a little sunburned, a little hungry, and very surprised when OG the caveman from the next valley over shows up with a rock bigger than your head. Congratulations, you've just experienced prehistoric warfare, and it's about as sophisticated as you'd expect. These early conflicts were less about grand strategy and more about, well, bonking. Essentially, whoever had the biggest rock, or the sharpest stick, usually won. This era established a brutal truth: humans are really, really good at finding ways to hurt each other. In fact, archaeologists have found evidence of organized violence dating back tens of thousands of years, challenging the Rousseauesque notion of a peaceful, noble savage, in our past. Some theorize, rather darkly, that warfare played a significant role in shaping human social structures and cooperation itself. That is, if you don't band together, OG and his friends are coming for your turnips and your skull. Historians still argue whether early warfare was primarily driven by resource scarcity, territorial disputes, or simply good old-fashioned tribal animosity. Regardless, it's safe to say that tactical innovation at this stage involved little more than hit them harder and run faster. Now, fast forward a few millennia. Bronze is all the rage, civilizations are sprouting up like particularly aggressive weeds, and warfare is getting a major upgrade. You're now a soldier in a phalanx, a tightly packed formation of spear-wielding hoplites. You sweat next to Steve the Spearman and hope that the bloke next to him actually bathed this week. This is warfare, Greek style. Discipline is key, and individual glory takes a back seat to the collective good. The phalanx was a formidable force, able to withstand frontal assaults from larger, less organized armies. Think of it as a spiky, slow-moving wall of human determination. Of course, it had its weaknesses. Flanking maneuvers could spell disaster, and uneven terrain was definitely not its friend. This era also saw the rise of sieges, as cities became increasingly fortified. Imagine the sheer frustration of staring at a huge wall, knowing that delicious snacks and comfortable beds were on the other side. The solution? Siege engines, of course. From battering rams to catapults, armies developed ingenious ways to hurl massive objects at enemy fortifications. One fun fringe fact is that the ancient Greeks even experimented with flamethrowers using naphtha. Basically, they were setting things on fire long before it was cool, or safe. You almost want to tell them that they're going to regret it later when they have to pay for the smoke damages. Next, we have Rome. Ah, Rome. They really took what the Greeks did and dialed it up to 11. You are now part of a Roman legion, and the phrase, attention to detail, doesn't even begin to cover it. Your kit is standardized, your training is rigorous, and your marching speed is legendary. Seriously, the Romans could march for days with all their gear, build a fort at the end of it, and still be ready for a fight. It's honestly kind of exhausting just thinking about it. The Roman army's success was based on its superior organization, logistics, and engineering. They built roads, bridges, and fortifications that allowed them to project power across vast distances. This, combined with their emphasis on discipline and adaptability, made them the dominant military force of their time. Remember Steve the Spearman? His great-great-great-grandson is now a Roman legionary, and he's still complaining about the guy who doesn't bathe. But, hey, at least he has a better helmet now. The Roman military wasn't just about conquering territory, it was also a powerful tool for Romanization. Conquered peoples were often integrated into the Roman army, which helped to spread Roman culture and maintain peace within the empire. The Romans were also keen on psychological warfare. They knew that fear could be just as effective as brute force. Historians still argue whether the decline of the Roman army was a cause or a symptom of the decline of the Roman Empire itself. Now, you're in the Middle Ages, and things are getting, well, medieval. You're a knight, clad in shining armor. Or at least you think it's shining. Turns out, armor gets dirty pretty quickly when you're spending all day riding around on a horse and hacking at other knights. Feudalism has fragmented power, and warfare has become a more localized affair. Knights, with their superior training and equipment, dominate the battlefield. The medieval period saw the development of castles, which served as both defensive fortifications and symbols of power. These were not just simple stone structures, they were complex systems of walls, towers, and traps, designed to withstand prolonged sieges. Siege warfare continued to evolve, with the introduction of new and improved siege engines, such as the trebuchet, which could hurl massive stones with devastating accuracy. One quirky tidbit: knights often customized their armor and weaponry, adding personal crests and insignias to distinguish themselves on the battlefield. It was basically medieval bling. Speaking of bling, you know how knights took oaths and had codes of chivalry. It was considered dishonorable to strike an unarmed opponent and so on. Yeah, well, the oath only applied if they were fighting fellow knights, not peasants. It's amazing how often they forget to mention that part. Fast forward again. The Renaissance dawns, and with it, gunpowder. Suddenly, your shining armor isn't looking so shiny anymore. You're now a pikeman, part of a large infantry formation designed to counter cavalry charges. It isn't long before you realize that a pikeman is essentially a human lightning rod for cannonballs. You're equipped with a ridiculously long pike, which is great for keeping enemies at bay, but terrible for navigating crowded streets. It's like carrying a really annoying fishing rod everywhere. The introduction of gunpowder weapons revolutionized warfare, rendering traditional fortifications obsolete and shifting the balance of power away from heavily armored knights. Infantry, armed with muskets and pikes, became the dominant force on the battlefield. The era also saw the rise of professional armies, trained and equipped by centralized states. These armies were much more disciplined and effective than the feudal levies of the past. I mean, it's kinda hard to argue with gunpowder, isn't it? Now, the early modern period. Warfare becomes increasingly complex, with a greater emphasis on tactics, strategy, and logistics. You're now a soldier in a line infantry regiment, dressed in a brightly colored uniform, because camouflage is obviously overrated, and armed with a musket. Your job is to stand in a line, fire volleys at the enemy, and try not to get shot. It's as thrilling as it sounds. Think of them as organized, brightly dressed targets. The Napoleonic Wars brought about significant changes in military organization and tactics. Napoleon's Grande Armée was a highly mobile and flexible force, capable of conducting rapid maneuvers and decisive attacks. He was also a master of propaganda, using it to inspire his troops and demoralize his enemies. But let's not forget, the real heroes were the quartermasters who kept the army supplied. Honestly, it was easier to convince people to charge into a hail of bullets than it was to organize enough rations for an army to move. Then we arrive at the 20th century and, well, things go really, really wrong. You're a soldier in a trench on the Western Front during World War I. It's cold, wet, and muddy, and you haven't slept properly in days. The air is filled with the sound of artillery fire and the stench of death. Trench warfare is a brutal, static form of combat that resulted in unprecedented casualties. The introduction of new technologies, such as machine guns, poison gas, and tanks, only made things worse. Imagine being charged by a tank. Now imagine being in a trench trying to use a rifle against it. The tank is literally your worst nightmare become reality. The strategic and tactical innovations of the war were a bitter evolution of efficiency, with industrialized death becoming the norm. You just hope that it ends soon, but it won't. Even in modern warfare, many people still argue whether technological superiority or troop morale is more decisive. That is, even if you have the best equipment, it doesn't necessarily mean that you'll win. And that's, pretty much where we are. From rocks to rifles, warfare has come a long way, and yet, in some ways, it hasn't changed at all. The desire to dominate, to control, to protect, these motivations have been with us since the dawn of time. Hopefully, one day, we'll find a better way. But until then, sleep tight. Okay, come closer, pull up a cushion, maybe grab a chamomile tea. Let's settle in and, whispers, let's talk about medieval battles. I know, sounds like a guaranteed nap inducer, right? But trust me, there's actually some fascinating stuff here, and we'll get through it together, nice and slow. Picture this, you trudge through the mud, the chill seeping into your bones despite the layers of wool you're wearing. The air hangs thick with the smell of wet earth, sweat, and something vaguely metallic. That's fear, mostly. And a little bit of questionable hygiene. You grip your spear, the wood rough against your palm. Your heart drums a frantic rhythm against your ribs, a counterpoint to the distant, ominous rumble that signals the enemy's approach. You're just a foot soldier, probably a farmer a few weeks ago, now facing a reality far grimmer than worrying about the harvest. This is medieval warfare. And before you write it off as just guys hitting each other with pointy sticks, consider this, it shaped the world. Seriously. The feudal system, the rise of nation-states, even the concept of chivalry, all forged in the crucible of constant conflict. Think of it as, historical blacksmithing. Bashing and hammering civilizations into new shapes. Now, a mainstream historical fact for you, the Battle of Hastings in 1066. William the Conqueror, Norman invaders, arrow to the eye, blah blah blah. You've heard it all. But here's a quirky tidbit, apparently, some Norman soldiers actually pretended to die, then jumped back up to attack the English, who were, understandably, rather surprised. Talk about playing possum. Historians still argue whether this tactic significantly contributed to the victory, or if it's just a fun anecdote embellished over time. Personally, I'm leaning towards embellished, but who knows? Maybe William had a theater major in his army. You squint, trying to pierce the gloom. You see movement, a glint of sun on steel, the flicker of banners. The opposing army, a sea of faces you don't recognize, all united by the singular goal of making your day exceptionally bad. You think about running, but then you remember the stories. Stories of glory, of courage, of, well, survival. Probably best to stick with the pointy stick. Speaking of stories, let's talk Joan of Arc. Mainstream historical fact: peasant girl, visions, led the French army, burned at the stake. Tragic, inspiring, the whole 9 yards. But here's a quirky tidbit: did you know she apparently had a specific battle cry that sounded something like "Allez, au nom de Dieu," which roughly translates to "Go forth, in the name of God." Picture her leading the charge, yelling that at the top of her lungs. Somehow, I find it oddly endearing. Historians still argue about the extent of her military genius. Was she a divinely inspired tactician, or a charismatic figurehead used by shrewd commanders? Maybe a little of both. And maybe a lot of yelling. The enemy is closer now. You can hear their war cries, a cacophony of guttural shouts and the clash of weapons. You clench your jaw, trying to ignore the tremor in your hands. You're just one person, a tiny cog in a massive, brutal machine. But you have a job to do. You have to stand your ground. Otherwise, where would humanity get its next batch of TikTok memes? Seriously, think of the potential. Medieval battle reenactment gone wrong, trying medieval armor for the first time, reacting to medieval sieges. The possibilities are endless. Okay, quick aside. I read somewhere that some medieval knights actually paid extra to have their armor polished to a mirror sheen. Apparently, looking fabulous on the battlefield was a priority. Can you imagine? Hold on, lads, gotta buff my breastplate before we charge. Don't want to clash with the blood, do we? I mean, talk about commitment to style. Which reminds me of another historical fact: knights. Fancy armor, code of chivalry, damsels in distress, the whole package. But here's the quirky thing: did you know that some knights employed squires whose sole job was to carry their chamber pots? Talk about a humbling experience. Historians still debate how seriously the code of chivalry was actually followed. Was it a genuine ethical framework, or just a glorified PR stunt? Probably a bit of both, depending on the knight, and how far away the aforementioned chamber pot was. The battle begins. A deafening roar erupts as the two armies collide. You brace yourself, lowering your spear. The first wave crashes against you, a chaotic jumble of steel and muscle. You thrust, feeling a sickening thud as your spear finds its mark. You recoil, heart pounding, and scramble for a new position. Around you, men fall, their screams lost in the din of battle. It's brutal, terrifying, and, surprisingly exhausting. You wonder if there's a medieval equivalent of a coffee break. Or maybe just a nice, long nap. Remember the longbow? Mainstream historical fact: English longbowmen were devastatingly effective, especially at battles like Crécy and Agincourt. But here's a quirky tidbit: apparently, training with a longbow could actually deform your skeleton over time. Years of pulling back those heavy bows could lead to noticeable changes in bone structure. I guess you could say they were, puts on sunglasses, bone to be wild. Historians still argue whether the longbow was truly the game-changer it's often portrayed as. Did it really revolutionize warfare, or was its impact somewhat exaggerated? Still, can you imagine going to a doctor and them saying, "Ah yes, you have the longbowman's shoulder"? A common ailment of the 14th century. You fight on, fueled by adrenaline and a primal instinct to survive. The battle rages around you, a swirling vortex of violence. You see acts of incredible courage, and acts of unspeakable cruelty. You realize that war is not glorious, or romantic, or even particularly logical. It's just, messy. And exhausting. Which reminds me of those epic battle scenes in movies. They look so clean. Everyone's hair is perfectly styled, their armor is gleaming, and they're all shouting incredibly witty one-liners while performing acrobatic sword fights. In reality, you'd probably be covered in mud, exhausted beyond belief, and desperately trying not to get stabbed. And as far as witty one-liners go, probably something like, "Ow! My spleen." And that's why medieval battles are still relevant today. Because they remind us of the fundamental truths about human nature. The capacity for both incredible violence and incredible resilience. The absurdity of conflict. And the enduring power of stories. Alright, voice softens, let's just, let the images fade a little. You're not trudging through mud anymore. You're here, safe and sound, maybe curled up on your couch. The sounds of battle are gone, replaced by the gentle hum of the refrigerator, or the distant chirping of crickets. The chill in your bones has vanished, replaced by the warm comfort of your blanket. Think of those longbow men stretching their weary muscles, dreaming of soft beds and peaceful fields. Imagine Joan of Arc, not as a figure in history, but as a young woman finding strength in her convictions. And remember that even in the midst of chaos and brutality, there is always hope. There is always the possibility of finding courage, of finding connection, of finding, almost whispering, peace. Let the weight of history settle, and then gently, release it. Let the images soften, and the sounds fade, further and further away. Until all that remains is the quiet, the stillness, and the promise of a restful sleep. Sweet dreams.